Morning, everyone. My name's Dan Doyle. I'm Chief Operating Officer with the Beach Company. Beach Company is based here in Charleston. This is the founder of the company, J.C. Long. And the company was founded in 1945 when he purchased the Isle of Palms. The Isle of Palms is a barrier island just north of downtown Charleston, outside of Mount Pleasant. And over time, he developed that as well as a number of significant projects that you see throughout the city here. Today, this is a picture of Isle of Palms, truly one of the great beach destinations in the United States and one of the great beach towns here outside of Charleston. Descendants of Mr. Long still own the company to this day. And since 1945, and really over the past 20 years, we've grown significantly. So what used to be a very local Charleston company now has a footprint throughout the Southeast. And that's our primary focus today. That product type consists of high-rise, mixed-use, very complicated projects. We also do lower-rise, urban infill, mixed-use projects. A number of projects, when we're dealing with sites like this, require significant remediation. They may be adaptive reuse or have other conditions associated with them. This is actually in downtown Columbia, and those who are familiar with South Carolina, this used to be what was known as the Central Correctional Institution. It was also the state penitentiary. So really transformative type developments that change and become new neighborhoods in downtown areas. And then finally, very traditional suburban garden style apartments. One project I did want to mention is the DNA, the history of the company, along with the Isle of Palms. We've always had a large master plan community underway. Isle of Palms, Kiowa Island, Seaside Farms in Mount Pleasant, and now Kiowa River out on Johns Island, just across the Kiowa River from Kiowa Island. This doesn't have a golf course. It's 2,000 acres. It's really focused on nature and embracing the land. And that becomes a big part of what will make this and what has made it such a successful development to date. So these will always be the type of projects that we do, from master plan communities to mixed use and pretty much everything between. With that, I'll turn it over to Robert.
My name's Bob Turner. I started out in 1990. We kind of found by living in a place like we live in Beaufort, South Carolina. It's an hour and a half south of here. It's a beautiful coastal town. And Vince Graham and I both grew up together, and we both lived in Beaufort, and we both loved what we saw. So we got into the idea of developing great neighborhoods. And at the time, Seaside was getting started, and we had heard about that project and went down and saw that, and then we just toured a bunch of great little towns. And so we started different project in 1992, New Point, then went on and did some infill stuff, and then this is the project that we're finishing up now. It's Habersham in Beaufort, South Carolina, and we're also working on a project up in Cincinnati called Union Village that Mike did the master plan for. But, we're talking about places and great places. I think the key, this is what, to me, at the end, if you can do everything wrong or right at the beginning, but at the end, if this works, this is what it's all about when you start to see the way it functions for your residents and the people that live around you. We put on several festivals all year, and these are the kind of things that we bring people in from all over. And this is when I think you really see the plan come together. So, this project is 282 acres, a little over 1,000 units. We picked up some land across the street, and we'll do another 300 over there, and it's mixed use. We have everything from 900 square foot houses to multi-million-dollar houses, apartments to townhomes and mansion flats. So it's kind of a variety of homes. And then we have a town center. That's kind of where we host all our events, and that's kind of really the marquee of the whole project. And then just kind of some of the amenities and what the housing looks like in the neighborhood. We borrowed mainly from housing that was in the area, architectural and kind of antebellum architecture, I guess, in Beaufort, and kind of went with that. This is the project up in Ohio we just started. This one's 4,500 units, and mixed use commercial, and we just starting some of the residential up there. And this is kind of quite new for that market. It's been a bit of a challenge trying to get people to understand what new urbanism is in that part of the world. So.
I began working as an architect. I studied architecture in school, worked as an architect, but really wanted to be involved in using my passion for that architecture profession to shape community. And found myself following the work of this firm down in Miami, Andres Duani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. And in 1988, I showed up at one of their charrettes outside Maryland to help, and offered to help during the course of that week. And 35 years later, I still live there and have opened an office there. In fact, worked for Andres and Liz for about 20 years, and then since this is an ICAA event, it might be worth mentioning that I took the year off to do the master's program that the ICAA offered with Georgia Tech. I was in the first class that did that program, which was fantastic, and then started my own practice doing much the same work afterward. And the images that I've chosen to share are more related to the process that we participated in as town architects, both for Kentlands and then at a second project, Norton Commons, both DPZ master plans, but both places where we were involved doing kind of the continuous design refinement that occurs as these places build out over decades, really. There we go. When I first started working for Andres, and I asked him how I could get up to speed on this kind of work they were doing. Well, first of all, I didn't realize that this was only about their third community development, the Kentlands neighborhood. But he told me to read this book by Raymond Unwin, Town Planning in Practice. And I'm going to read the quote, something I rarely do, but it describes very well, I think, the role of the town architect in these communities. The book was written in 1909, but I think you'll agree it sounds like it could have been written today. Unwin wrote, "So long as each architect thinks only of his own building, how individual and how noticeable he can make it, little progress in the total effect can be expected. Architects should be trained to think first of how their building will take its place in the picture already existing. The harmony, the unity that binds buildings together and welds the whole into a picture is so much more the most important consideration that it should take precedence. Within the limits of this enclosing unity, there's plenty of scope for variety without resorting to that type which destroys all harmony by its blatant shouting." So the role of the town architect, as I see it, is really to help make these individual buildings into a physical community, and then, as Bob and Dan were pointing out too, into the social community that exists in and between the buildings. So this is the Kentlands property, 352 acres outside DC. This is what it looks like today, and our office still in the neighborhood. Our work is all over the place now, but still in the neighborhood. In some of the areas, one in particular, I'll point to this one, there was the need from the original plan to connect a street between some blocks here, but up a challenging slope. Where the plan had originally proposed this as a street, the city came in and said it would be much too steep to build that as a street. We said do it as a pedestrian path instead, which at the time was frowned upon for a number of reasons. First, they raised the question about who would want to live in a house that doesn't face a street. Well, you know, we had an excellent story shared with us this morning about just how wonderful that can be. In this case, we did persuade one of the builders to put this proposal in their sales office just for a weekend to kind of gauge reaction to something like this. And they took holds on 6 out of the 8 lots in 48 hours. And we were in the developer's office the next Monday morning adding 2 more groups like this to the neighborhood. So that kind of refinement was taking place all within the context of some design standards. As we heard this morning, sometimes we're looking for rules to kind of shape or guide these places. We had a very simple set of design standards based really largely on the seaside standards that produced a place that looks like this. The top right image is are the houses on the pedestrian path. And then the second neighborhood, this one is Norton Commons, as I said, also a DPZ master plan. And the example that I'll point to is this piece from their original plan, which was the first phase. We learned the importance of really refining the first phase carefully to be able to share with people that, in fact, you're being deliberate about the design of community here. And so you'll notice one of the changes was from the straight street that went across with houses in their sides along the major road to fronting houses on the major road and then pushing that street in to create space. This was the original sales office in this location. So the salesperson could step out and actually into a space shaped by these houses. And then we bent the street just slightly, placing a house with a tower here and then continuing down to the town center. So they built every type that they were offering in the community, large houses all the way to mixed-use buildings from beginning to end of the first street. So you could really get a sense of what that place might be like eventually. And there's just some shots now of this street under construction. Here's the house with the tower and the variety of, one of the things that was done actually to increase the variety was to build 3 identical houses next to each other. That took a little persuasion, but one builder was willing to do that and worked out just fine. Here's what that street looks like finished, but before the trees. But one thing that this founder has done that they've done really well from the beginning are curating those kinds of events that Bob was talking about in his community. And this is one of the first ones where the deli operator here asked if he could just come out and close the street, and the town founder got behind them to enable them to close the street, have an event out there, start attracting people. And it was very easy when they did that to sell community, in fact. And promoting those kinds of events was the best form of advertising that they pursued. We also refined some of the rules that the builders were asked to follow in terms of what they could do on their lots and so forth. And then these are some shots of what was eventually built there. The event's now grown from the closed street over here to a town square that's at this point actually not yet complete. But here you see that town square completed. Oh, and one more, the large events are now hosted in their outdoor amphitheater. This is where you take over.
Hi, everyone. My name's, again, Brian O'Looney from Tortigals & Partners. I come from a very interesting firm. At the moment, we work the full range of construction from single-family residential to high-rise construction. So this is one of my partner's projects, Murphy Antoine, with this is single-family military production housing out in the West Coast that was built at the time for $50 a foot. And these are newer projects that one is a tower outside of DC that's being worked on by one of my partners. The one on the left is one my team worked on the Balmacı in Turkey in the main corridor leading from the new commercial district to the core of the city. So we work at all these scales. And we're working at a very tight price point for our project. So I put this slide up just to be that this is the main focus of our clients is to keep the dollars in line. And what we're going to talk about today is primarily at the lower end of this spectrum. But our work tends to, and so we're going to talk about neighborhood centers in a second. This is one when I was at David Schwartz's office we worked on, which is taking the neighborhood center program, i.e. the supermarket anchored strip center, and finding a way of doing it differently. Each of these panel members have done this in a very creative way, and so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I moved to Tortigals, and we did a lot of mixed-use buildings, residential over retail, all at a very tight price point. So these buildings are, except for the brick facade, are all styrofoam. They're all EIFS. The windows, in order to make this project be cost-effective, every window in that building is the same. And that was a way to get that building to price out. And you could, I want to go back. And so what we try to do in our work is at very humble fees, come up with architecture that contributes to place compared to what you'll see on the left, which is sort of the examples of the, warranty schedule from James Hardy driving the facade design in many ways. And so we try to figure a way to use the same materials, keep to the warranties, but not have that be the way that the building, the result, that forces the design of the multifamily. This is another multifamily for that same client in this one in Hampton, Virginia. Again, you can see the community's embraced it by throwing a parade. The buildings in the foreground are all EFIS, all styrofoam. And then the building in the back is brick. We try with these larger buildings, so that's where my main career is focused these days, is on these type 3 and type 5 buildings, which are wood over occasionally concrete, but also wood just multifamily, typically the most cost-effective way to build housing. We try to find ways of breaking down these larger buildings so they fit into their community. So this one here is in South Orange, New Jersey. You can see this is the context of South Orange. And so we used a couple devices in the design of this building, mainly brought an octagonal tower like Mike did at Norton that related to a lot of the octagonal towers in their town, broke down the facade and the massing. This is a 5-story building, but it looks like 2 on the outside. We played some tricks to achieve that by having long fingers come off the building that step down to hide the mass. And then we look at the increment of the town, the facades. These are every different facade identity, and try to get our building to come down to a scale in a way that fits into that community. We did the same thing in the place just up the road in Somerville, New Jersey. Very similar. This one had a train station. This was a suburban parking lot. We incorporated the train station in the building. And then this is one Type 5 Texas donut designed to look like multiple buildings coming around a civic plaza. And so the train station entrance is here. The city put their borough meeting hall in that part there. This just opened a couple weeks ago. So this is, again, this is at a very lean price point, well under 200 a foot, if not at 175 to build. We're now going to get into the questions for the panel. First question is just talking about the value of a plan, and I think this question should be really addressed to the developers and the team, because you could have gone out there and worked the conventional method, but you both took the step to not only have a plan, to pay for a plan up front, but also pay for some of the coding and the pattern book work. And so when I hear a little bit about what made you make those decisions on the projects to take that leap of faith, to understand what that could achieve for you.
I'll start. For us, it is a matter of, much like the majority of the people in this room, I'm sure, the idea of quality and being able to start an idea from the perspective that what you're going to do is going to be high quality and is going to be the best. And that's putting together a team of consultants that you have trust in and that you know are going to be able to deliver. Now, it also has to tie in with the product and who the target market is. Great design costs money. We're not here asking for anyone to do this work for free. We know it costs money. And the end product, there has to be a market for that at the end of the day. So our challenge as a developer is making sure that we're aligning the product with the market, and that product and how that will eventually be arrived at through a programmatic design process meets that market. So that's critical for us.
I would say, because we're basically just doing new urbanist neighborhoods, but early on in 1990 when we started New Point, there really wasn't much out there. There weren't many people to go to. There wasn't anybody designing not many designing the traditional architecture we needed for single family. So we kind of created a plan that fit on the site, and then we kind of used the areas around us to create the code, which was a very, very, very simple code. And then, as we all got smarter, we created more advanced codes. And when you get into a scale like Habersham scale of 1,000 units plus, DPZ did the plan for us and did the coding for us, and it was a step up from what we had before, but it was really it allowed a lot of flexibility, which is, I think, from a developer, super important. That's what we're running into. And then, since then, we've advanced the code again. So, but I think the code, combined with the plan, you're going to change, things are going to change in the market. You're going to shift blocks a little bit. You're going to shift product type for sure. But we try to stay with the pattern of the main street network and everything else. But it's basically just like building a house. It's the blueprint. You have to have it. You have to have a good one. You have to have one that can sustain market changes and dynamics in markets. And so I think it's incredibly important for that.
When you pivot, how do you, if you realize that one type is selling better than another, how do you select where the plan is adjusting? So where you move, let's say that the 4,000 square foot house is selling all of a sudden for the right, and that fits in certain parts of the site. How do you manage that?
I would say, like in our case, it was mainly shifting in a multifamily realm. Having a plan, our plan was laid out on 18-foot grids. So it was 18, 36, 72, and everything we did seemed to work on that grid pattern. I think that was really incredible the way that laid out. So our block structure is what changed, not really the street network, but changing that block structure and having that flexibility. So we went from looking at doing condos when the market was great in condos to then we shifted to townhomes that were 18 and 36, and then we went from a live work that was a 18 to a 36, and then shifted into apartments when apartments came. So all that was technically not planned. We had an overall density that we had to stay within, but the uses were flexible, which again was a great plan. Putting flexibility in the plan up front is tremendous, and we just shifted within that block structure with that.
May I jump in? In response to the first question, if I may, as the designer on the panel, I think a good plan is essential to start with, and that developers should be prepared to pay a lot of money for those plans. With regard to the code and how the codes evolve over time, what I've found is as the design standards become more refined, they should become lighter because your vision for the place is becoming more and more clarified. And so that design code could become much lighter. So I'm going to offer a code that you all are welcome to implement free of charge, if you like. It's one sentence long. It is out the front door, you do as you're told. Out the back door, you do as you please. So I think with that in mind and a clear vision, you can end up with an excellent public realm and virtually complete freedom and back at the same time. Would you switch back to the last plan and I'll answer the second question if I may?
Sure.
Thanks. So this is the plan for Norton Commons, which is zoned. In this case, this was very early on in the days of the use of the term, the transect. So this still uses the older terminology, neighborhood center, neighborhood general, and neighborhood edge. And the way these standards were written is in such a way that those zones actually overlap. They're parametric, and the range of possibilities with each zone actually overlaps with the zone next to it. So for example, anything you could do in neighborhood general, you could do in the neighborhood center or in the neighborhood edge within to a certain degree. But what you can't do is do, say, the single family house in the neighborhood edge in the neighborhood center, or the business that belongs to the neighborhood center at the neighborhood edge. So that's the way in which variety was permitted flexibility in the plan in terms of which type goes where.
So I'm going to ask a question about that plan then. So at Norton Commons, the buildings that align Meeting Street, Linear Green were originally visioned as live works. You can see in the plan there. But in the end, that got built as something different. So talk us through that process and how you managed to maintain the incremental feel along Meeting Street.
Okay, so there's a longer answer to this because this street actually wasn't in the original plan. This street came later when that's an earlier drawing of it. That's right. Yeah, okay. So at the bottom of the image here is just out of the frame is I-71, and that particular site had various potential uses. At one time, it was an expansion for a nearby a hospital. It wound up, it was an office park in one iteration, eventually became multifamily housing across the bottom to kind of seal off the interstate. As the uses were more intense and more mixed use, there was a decision made to connect a street from that degree of density and intensity back to the main square. So that's the addition of the square that you see. Initially, it was thought that it might be live-work units along there to continue the commercial from the square down to that density. But somebody came in and wanted to do subsidized senior housing, which everyone thought would be a great addition to the plan, a way to expand the range of residential types in the neighborhood. So essentially, the property lines were erased, but the urban form, the street, its location, where the parking was placed, and so forth, stayed the same. So it was really just a switch to a different building type and a slightly different form for the use.
All right, well, let's talk about tenure a little bit. So these are projects, I believe, that started as one tenure and went to another, so it went from rental to condo or condo to rental. Bob, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, up on the right, the left corner, upper left corner. So those are our, we call them flats, but those were condominiums, and and at the time when the market was strong for that, that's what we were doing. And then we got, as those slipped away, we got into apartments, which is on the right lower corner, left upper, right lower corner. We switched over to apartments, but the block structure was exactly the same, and it was working off that 18-foot grid. But again, it's that flexibility of building into the plan, the ability to do it. So we have basically almost in probably 4 blocks of the neighborhood, a complete transect from single family all the way up to the multifamily apartments at a higher density. So,
have you found that there was a challenge with folks not wanting rental uses within the neighborhood or within the plan? Have you had that challenge?
oh, yeah. I would always start with that if it's an opportunity. It's always the case in which if you had a veil, you could just lay over the entire building, build it, and then pull it, and everybody would just see it. It was just fine. So, of course, we had plenty of comments when we went to the higher density, and then the idea of even being rentals from ownership. But then, it just died. We tried to work. These are a little bit garden-style apartments. We were working with the developer. We had a budget. And we tried to take his buildings and simplify them as best we could and to fit on a street grid with parallel parking. But it happens. It's because of the bad planning and the bad design in the past that people point to us. Like, they think of apartments, they think of this instead of that. And these actually became rented up by many residents who were scaling down and other things, so it worked out fine.
So this is part of our task here is going to be to talk about getting the vertical design right, getting the architecture to contribute to the plans done well. And in this case, at a market price point. So is it possible to code the vertical? Where does coding break down and become too vague or too prescriptive? And I have an example from the Morristown form-based code above, which tries, and its best example is with the townhouse, but and then below that, there's another example. This is from Clarksburg. This is in the area that we had worked on together, but then wasn't regulated, wasn't led by a town architect, and you can see the results for yourself. So the question is, what can we do to get the vertical architecture better? What processes work better? And the next couple slides are going to deal with this question. Mike, I'll leave.
Well, I think doing a better job educating architects would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
I mean, with good designers, with good architects working in these communities, you would need a code. The basic rules could be laid out. One of the simplest codes is one Andres, who I just saw a moment ago, actually brought to my attention for Old Town Alexandria. The Carlisle building there. Old Town was supposed to be Virginia's first town. The first guy, John Carlisle, starts building his big mansion here in this new town with a big green lawn around it. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So they wrote a very simple code which said all of the private buildings had to be pulled right up to the street, and they had to have a horizontal eave to the street. But the public buildings would have gable ends to the street to set them apart. And the code is really all about shaping the public realm, which is, I think, the most important thing. It's unfortunate when you get bad buildings, but it's a disaster when you get horrible public realm. You know, we've been living with that now for decades. And I think that's first and foremost the thing to solve. And then we can look at the architecture and fuss over eave details and that sort of thing, and truly make a more beautiful place. But clearly, for me at least, the first thing to solve is the nature of the design of the public realm.
I want to talk a little bit about style and how we manage the use of style, architectural style within projects. I think this slide was going to be more about regulating plan and pattern books. But the question is, I mean, sometimes you can be very prescriptive. This is a Frisco Square, which I'll share in a second, that had prescriptive styles and then required implementation of styles. But you can also do it more loosely where you allow for a variety of styles. And in that case, maybe a lot gets built in colonial, but not much gets built in Victorian. So how did you manage that in your projects to get a balance? Let's talk to you, Dan.
It's really just starting out with the set of architectural guidelines in the pattern book. And if you can go ahead and include multiple styles and a little bit more variety and not have it too regulated, what I've always found is you're sitting in, you know, if we have a single family neighborhood and we have a monthly design review meeting where a builder or a homeowner are bringing a plan forward, no matter how well thought out or communicated those guidelines are, they're always going to come with something different. And what I've always found, it's a conversation back and forth. It's an education. And I think there has to be a willingness on both parts to understand that, you know, maybe if something doesn't fit perfectly within those guidelines, doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It could just be a new idea and something that hopefully will add value to the community at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would say, you know, some of the greatest places that are historic places, Charleston, for example, you know, the style, it's because the city took 100 years, 200 years to build, so the style adjusted over time. And so for what we're doing today, to pre-program style before and try to finish a project in 5 years that normally would have taken 100 is extremely difficult. And how to pull that off and not to make it too contrived, I think is a big challenge. I think what we've got to design, to me, for in the future is market. What's the market going to do? Because that's what the developer is going to have to do. So things like, if we're going to see times in which housing is going to be so expensive, and we're seeing it. What do? What instead of a style, maybe what is the product? So I think that is kind of the most important thing that we need as a developer to help us achieve affordability. At the families coming back to the house, of course, we're doing houses, all family living in one house kind of thing. But it's kind of hard to I think to pre-program a style too dramatically in a project. I think you got to just kind of look at market and how it was driven. Charleston went through ups and downs. You can see it in the architecture as you walk down the streets. The ornate and during the periods of wealth and those other periods, and that's what dictated it. It wasn't pre-programmed. It wasn't pre-designed. So it's a challenge.
So this is a bit of our communication in the past, where we get a red line from Mike on a code we're working on together. And what's interesting about this is it starts to talk about the different ways that you can set up the process of regulating as things get built. And so in this case, you were arguing that the town architect shouldn't be relied on so much, that you could also have a committee, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that, like what you think is better left to a community review board and what can be better regulated by a town architect, and when does a community review board come on board and become successful. And I should mention that I had served on the community review board in Counties where we both live. So.
This particular project had unique beginnings because it grew out of a lawsuit because of how the developer interpreted the code requirements for the county, that they had gotten some things built that didn't actually comply, so residents were suing the developer, and we were called in, when the development team had a design consultant involved in advising them, the citizens decided they wanted a design consultant to advise them. And there was a whole conversation about how that should happen. We were asked to advise the residents in terms of what their expectations could realistically be in that situation. And there were a couple of firms under consideration to advise the developer going through this mediation process. And I called John Torty and said, what if we both agreed to serve these respective clients, but together? So they hire us jointly together, and we give one set of recommendations back to the community, which seems to be the nature of mediation anyway. That's the way that process is supposed to happen. And it turns out the judge liked the idea, and so we worked together to come up. So the critique of the standards is really John and I going back and forth to find something that we thought everybody could live with, and not so much a critique of standards, any of Torty Gallus's work or anything.
I understand that, but
okay.
it
Yeah, but
leads
just so they do
to
too.
the interesting question
Yeah.
of what are good ways to set a community forth so it can guide itself into the future. How long does a town architect need to stay in place? And in Kentlands, we still have ours, and it actually keeps serving us well. And the question is, what other methodologies can be used to keep the quality level high?
Okay, so I hate to keep saying everything is somehow unique, but in the case of the places that you mentioned, so Kentlands is somewhat unique in that 2 or 3 years into the development of the neighborhood, the deal failed financially. That's another conversation, the reasons why it had nothing to do with it being a traditional neighborhood. In fact, that's what it allowed it to survive. But the original developer handed the project back to the lender, and we essentially lost the vision keeper for the neighborhood. So in short order, the residents had to step in and become active in the neighborhood and how the neighborhood functions. So they got involved early on because they had to. That's one way you could do it. I don't recommend it to most of my developer clients. Norton Commons is in a different situation where 20 years later, the developer is still running the neighborhood, and they are weaning the residents off their level of involvement and encouraging more participation. And a great example of that is they've gone now from 10 concerts every year in that great outdoor pavilion to 5 that the developer sponsors, and the residents can sponsor their own if they choose to. And so they're kind of realizing now how much work the developer has been doing as a gift back to the neighborhood, and that they're having to take on some of these responsibilities now themselves. What was did you mention a third one? There was another one.
That's
Okay,
good, because you just led into another question, because Kentlands is not the only project that's failed in process. And so this is Frisco Square, which failed, and because it failed, it actually is an interesting example because the form-based code stayed in place the whole time, but throughout its growth, it had 4 different regiments of guidance. I'm going to go through them now to explain what happened. So on the left, we have a row of buildings that were done by a trusted architect who was involved to the end. And so the upper one, this one on the right is Albert Ryder Tittman. David Schwartz was the master planner and architect, and I worked for them when this was being done. The building on the left was one that we picked up 20 years later at Torty Gallus and complemented the Albert Ryder Tittman. But these are cases where the architect was hired by the development team and design architect kept all the way through. The next line is where a trusted architect was hired and then told to go away because we don't have the money to pay for you. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. So the upper one is an Opticos building. I'm not sure I can even mention who the middle one is, but the bottom one is at Robert Stern's office. And again, they came in, they did these buildings, and they handed the design off, and then the results are what they are. Like, I don't think Robert Stern would not want the brick to return on the side of his house, right? But those are the kinds of things that happen. The next category happened later. The project went into foreclosure after the developer was in place, and a new developer took over. Actually, a new developer took over and just let architects do their thing for a bunch of buildings. So this was where there was a form-based code, but buildings got built. You can see there's traditions kept in, but not necessarily with a high level of consideration for coordination and style, et cetera. And then finally, a new developer who was trained in the new urbanist world, a group called Arcadia, came in, and then they set up a pattern book and put in a town architect, which I served as, and then led for these buildings to get built. So these are market architects using pattern book with the guidance of the town architect. So with all that said, I wanted to ask this panel, that's a lot of cover, which of these methodologies works best for you and when? And there may be some cases where you're doing a project where it's far better to do one or the other. And so the question I have, I guess, Dan, I'll start with you. Obviously some of your smaller market rate projects in the city of Charleston are probably going to be take an architect running all the way through. Other ones are quick development deals, and you might use a market architect. So talk a little bit about those choices.
That's right. So anything that we have that's large scale, long term, when I say long term, anywhere from 5 to 25 years, we're going to have a trusted group of consultants that we'll continue to use, and they actively participate in the review process for new buildings that come online. Oftentimes, what you're talking about are going to be outlined in the covenants of the neighborhood. So those covenants, no matter how much we want to talk about how we want to do it, those covenants are going to tell you how it needs to be done. So we have to follow that process as well. At any given time, that decision-making gets turned over to the owning body or the governing body of the community. So it's a little bit of balance there. But in general, our preference is we bring a group in, we try to control it for as long as we can, and then ultimately have a trusted group that can take it once it is turned over to a group of homeowners or business owners.
I would say the same thing. I mean, I think you have to have somebody to carry the vision. Well, in some paid position after the developer's out, I think there's just got to be a common vision carrier to keep things going, because things will change. We have, I think one of the things when we found we were just broke ground on a church this past weekend, but we had a civic site for the church, and realized because it had the word civic on it and it hadn't been built on, and it was not we were donating it to the church, how much input we were going to get from our residents because of the word civic on there. So we ended up moving the church to get that church we wanted, and we just donated another piece of land that we owned as a developer. So it's that ownership you're going to get. Once the neighborhood matures, if there's any vacant land, I would have some kind of, I think it's great that they had the participation, but it just so much participation, nothing got done. We couldn't get it to the next level. So that's a risk. But civic, the word civic on any site is going to be, and if it's not built on by the developer, it's going to be, the owners are going to take that over. And there needs to be some group, and it could be design, the ownership should be of the residents, but they need to get together and come together and have some regulations that make that work. So.
Two quick examples. One is Seaside, which was designed with the idea of having a town architect in place on the ground working with the developer, who had a lot of leeway in terms of how the code was interpreted. Very strong town architect, and the code was written very broadly. As I've heard Andres himself point out, they're bad buildings at Seaside. The code is very broad. What's happening now as Robert prepares to transition to stronger resident control, including potentially the selection of the town architect, there's interest in moving to a tighter code in preparation for the possibility that there's a weaker town architect role. So from strong town, weak code to weak code, strong code, weak town architect, potentially. It's this Texas example that you point out is interesting because the presumption here is that in every case, there's a developer involved that's able to control what the architecture looks like. State laws changed recently in Texas where they can
Sure.
They can no longer control architecture to the extent they once could.
The jurisdiction no longer can control.
I'm sorry?
The jurisdiction can no longer
The
control.
jurisdiction cannot control it, right. So we were hired about 2 years ago to serve as an urban design consultant to a small town in Texas that still wanted to grow as a walkable mixed-use community and control what was important about the architecture within the bounds of the new state law. And that's been a challenge because a lot of the projects we become involved in are being designed by speculative land flippers, the people who come in, buy land, want to get it rezoned, roughly planned, and then sell it off. And there's little you can do to control the
So,
architecture.
I'm actually going to answer that because what we did at Frisco Square, go back to the book, so the jurisdiction said, okay, we can't control it anymore, but we can make you control it. And so what they did is that in order to get their zoning to land, they required the developer to have an HOA with a pattern book and a set of standards that they were having to regulate amongst themselves. So this is it's a POA, a Property Owners Association. So they said, well, we can't control your architecture, but you have to. And so, so they would not approve the overall PUD in the town. And they've done this for a number of PUDs in Frisco, and other towns are starting to do this, where they require a private regulation realm done through a pattern book and town architect. So that was the methodology chosen there. So this is some of the buildings that are getting built. This is the main circle getting built. That's the plan. But I mean, again, the history of this led to those 4 methodologies. And so I want to talk a little bit about that town architect role, because on the lower end of the scale, and when you're working with builders, as you all do, you're not able to get that high-end architect typically. And Seaside did for many of the homes, but typically you're working with a builder and who they have on their team. And so one question I have is to describe key aspects of the process you've used to implement and achieve the higher level of craft with builders, and with how do you communicate the expectation of that craft to the builders and ensure conformance to the vision? These are mock-ups we're able to use for those large buildings, but you're not probably able to do stuff like this in what you do. So let's talk about that a little bit. So Mike, what's your best tool to get builders to build well? Besides, okay, you see that house here, that's how I want it.
Well, really sitting across the table from whoever's designing the building, ideally in the presence of their client. That's the best tool. That's time-consuming and expensive. It's a great investment early on. It's one of the things that worked well at Norton Commons, because we were actually, at Norton Commons, you could get a set of CDs done for between $3,000 and $6,000 that consisted of a dozen 11 by 17 sheets. And that's a large set of drawings there, but typical of what it took to build most of the houses, what was viewed as affordable and appropriate and all there. Louisville has one of the largest chapters of the National Association of Home Builders in the country, so it's a very, it's a small builder market, and there's a high expectation of owner involvement in the design. So it's also time consuming for that reason. But once we got the local drafts people, the ones with the CAD certificate from the community college, once we helped them appreciate how and why there would be a better way to detail an eave or handle the door surround or design a porch, for the most part, they were pretty willing to do it. The architects were usually more the ones to resist that sort of advice and recommendations. But it had to be done pretty quickly. We didn't have a lot of time, so just because of the budget, so we would sometimes meet with them once, sometimes twice. Now it's done almost entirely long distance, because that's so much easier now than it was before. But
I think it's important for the developer to set the tone. If you go out to our Kiowa River development, look at the amenity space there. That amenity building, we refer to it as the spring house, that sets the tone for everything else going out there. Michael, you mentioned the public realm. The public spaces at Kiowa River set the tone for everything else going on out there. We have a hotel under construction. We have other event spaces now under construction. And it just continues to elevate the design throughout that neighborhood. And that will only continue as the neighborhood matures and we move forward to various phases.
Okay, so go ahead, Mike.
sorry, just want to add one thing, because I saw Steve Mouzon here earlier. We brought Steve Mouzon into Norton Commons early on because we had, we were getting horrible eave details and eave returns proposed in the neighborhood. And Steve has woodworking capabilities that I don't have, framing skills and so forth. And we brought Steve in to do a demonstration, not to the builders, but to their subs. In fact, we told the builders it was optional, but optional for them, but required for their subs to attend this day-long event, which, as it happens, was the end of July on one of those blistering hot, humid days. And you should have seen the attention that these guys gave Steve as he showed them the proper way to build an eave. 3 different conditions, from the more vernacular to the more refined. And when he left, when he was finished, there were 3 different properly designed and executed eave details on site for these kids basically to come look at. No one had ever told them the right way to do it again, or the right way to do it. And once they did, it was easy for them to do that. They understood how much better this could be and that they were a part of making it better and so forth. So that was also a great tool, a great contribution of Steve's to that neighborhood.
Since you mentioned him, one thing we do in the pattern books we've done is we actually incorporate by reference Steve Mouzon's traditional construction methods and the William Ware's American Vignola. And so every architect who works in those projects has to have that book to refer to, and you can communicate with them over the phone. Hey, go to this page, this is what you're supposed to do. And that's very powerful. So, all right, I want to talk a little bit, you mentioned how the commercial areas lead the overall project. So the commercial areas of Kentland, Seaside Farms, and Kiowa Island all have successful walkable streets formed by turning large format retailers like supermarkets and neighborhoods, your basic neighborhood center program, into a walkable district. And I want to talk a little bit, this is a big challenge to take that kind of program and make neighborhood out of it. So each of you, Kentlands, Kiowa, and Seaside Farms, which is on the screen now, which is very near Ion if you're going tomorrow, to talk a little bit about that. We have images. Dan, why don't you take this, because this is yours.
Yeah, this is a large, what I refer to it as horizontally mixed use community. It consists of single family, active adult, congregate care, custom single family, multifamily rental, and then what you see here is primarily our commercial corridor. And this was done over a period of time, but it really focused on the streetscape and how the success of those retailers were going to be dependent on pedestrian traffic walking through that neighborhood. And over time, we've added residential to be closer to that. We've placed the parking lots behind the retail, and it's been extremely successful and is a long-term project for us.
So this is Kiowa Island, which is to the south of us, but again, I actually put them all up at the same time. What's interesting, in all these projects, they somehow bury the anchor stores, and I wanted to ask, as developers, how did you get Harris Teeter and these large grocery chains to be willing to not be on the public view and to be buried? I mean, the success of this is to have just a small throat onto the public realm here and here, and at Kentlands here, to have the Whole Foods buried in and the large formats buried in and the main strip coming through here. And Seaside Farm, same thing. That was a Piggly Wiggly, and now it's Harris Teeter, right?
That's correct.
So how did you get those grocers to play nice?
Part of it may just be the fact of who the operator was.
Mm-hmm.
In both Freshfields as well as Seaside. But I think more importantly is they understood they had a captive market there. At Kiowa Island, there was no other place to go and get groceries. So it made tremendous sense for someone to be there and that operator. Same thing with Seaside Farms. Now, when Seaside Farms was originally developed, the town of Mount Pleasant was about 30,000 people plus or minus. It is approaching 100,000 right now. So it has seen tremendous growth, and it has been able to fit in. Harris Teeter now is at Isle of Palms and has a store in one of our centers there. So that's taken some of the pressure off of this store here at Seaside Farms. But more importantly, this becomes the heart of the neighborhood. It's a place where people can go. And it doesn't matter if it's at Kiowa Island or some more traditional suburban location.
We're working with the Kroger, and I think the other thing you hear from the marketing is that they need 3 years of if you're on a busy road, exposure, and then after that everybody knows they're there, then you can kind of, and that may be a negotiation that, after 3 years, we'll start to enclose you. But that's just something they've talked about, that's a kind of a compromise.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about how third places contribute to our neighborhoods and what you've done. Have you subsidized coffee shops or other kinds of tenants to make sure that your neighborhood has that anchor? And what have you done to ensure their success for your overall success?
It's the dream of every developer and every planner to have a very successful ground floor retail, very activated with residential above. And I can tell you, it's probably one of the most difficult type of projects to execute on. We're required to do that in just about every location. And I can show you examples that we have where we still have space that sits vacant because we simply can't fill the amount of space that a local municipality is going to require. So it is vital to the success of the project, more so from the standpoint of how that drives a prospective resident's desire to live there than it does the incremental revenue that you're going to generate in rent. So we take a very proactive approach, almost to the point right now where we're working hand in hand with the retailer or the user of that space to make it economically viable for them to be there, because we know in the long run it's going to benefit our residents that live in the building.
Yeah, it's basically, the first one especially, the first corner pub or the first third place, it's marketing dollars to get it going. You've got to get that going. It's what's going to set us apart. If you're selling town center and there's no town center, then what are you selling? So it's absolutely critical. And then what we found after we've matured and seen some businesses come in and go out, we've seen a lot of the pitfalls. One, we've found that smaller spaces are much better. Start small, and if they can expand, have an expansion area they can move to. But just help them along with their business model too. A lot of these are people, it's a dream for them, but they don't have business sense. So you've got to help look at their business plan before they start, give them suggestions. You know the numbers, tell them what the reality is going to be, and hopefully, they can make it work.
I think you need to be creative about what the third place is in the early days. It doesn't always have to be the coffee shop or the pub. They are challenging. I give the developers of Norton Commons, David Toms and Charles Osborne, a lot of credit for doing a great job seeding the place with community opportunities. And one of the first things they did was to take an area of dirt that they weren't using yet behind some of their houses and make it available to residents who requested space for a community garden. There's a big sign on the thing that says, we're going to develop this eventually, but in the meantime, you can grow stuff there if you want to. And there's a great photograph of some things growing in this area in this line of Adirondack chairs with wine glasses on the arm of the chair as the neighbors came together under the pretense of gardening, but really just to hang out with one another. Very affordable, great third place in early days of Norton Commons.
So I think we'll take a couple of questions if anyone would like to ask.
Vegetation, foliage, I noticed in some of the plans that I didn't see many. I saw in the individual homes, number one, the houses are close together. So I'm curious to know what you're finding effective as a lot line. And then I didn't see a lot of backyards. What I actually saw were large community spaces. So it's how people live today. We live more inside than outside, but in reality, what are you as developers and as designers actually encouraging people to do? Are you trying to encourage them outside into community? Are you giving them backyards? How close are your houses together? Some of it looks pretty tight to me, so I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I avoid suggesting that we give them backyards because that already has some connotation for many people, and instead suggest we give them outdoor rooms, which could be places to eat or cook or for kids to play or what have you. But once we're done training the architects, we need to get to work on the landscape architects to create and shape spaces for both private use as well as the public realm, because I think there's still a lot of work that can be done. There's some great ones out there, but it's hard to find architects that appreciate the value of an outdoor room, whether it's for private use or public use.
But are you, but with, I understand multi-use apartments here and townhouses here, but with the individual homes, are you allowing for an outdoor space? Okay.
Not on every lot because, it's the land you're paying for. So, and some people can afford more or less, but absolutely, that's an option. Yeah, for sure. Peter?
Is there a magic number of density to make retail work?
Yes, I think there are whole weekend seminars on that. In fact, it depends what type of retail and what exists in the larger area around where you're working.
Yeah, our retail is, I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere, and you can't find it. So, but what we've gotten is I think what's helped is we've created such a great space. People find it, and they'll come to it because they want to experience, especially outdoor dining and the comfort of that. And after COVID, it really blew up. But so I think we have about 60% of our business is from outside that comes into our neighborhood to make it work. And if we didn't have that, it wouldn't work with even 1,000 homes. So not what we have, 5 restaurants.